America, we have a feud going on between two social media giants, Ben Shapiro and Candace Owen. She is his employee, of course, at the Daily Wire, over an issue that Ben took with one of her tweets that seemed to describe a rather common theme with respect to the portrayal of Israel's self-defense. Sorry, my dog is moving around here. As a genocide. And of course, Ben Shapiro took issue with this, and it's become a feud ever since. Morgan, do you have the same kind of issues over there in the UK with the conservatives and the quote unquote liberals and their differences with, and the conservative split with respect to what should be done with Israel?
Not quite in the same way. So I think there's a bit more uniformity in the Conservative Party and the conservative movement more broadly, let's say, about Israel. And I think that largely comes from a feeling of responsibility relating to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which kind of committed Britain to creating a Jewish state. And I think, and Balfour was a conservative politician. So I think there's a lot of that which kind of lingers in the Conservative Party, a feeling of kind of paternal responsibility for taking care of Israel, making sure Israel's kind of supported, basically. There's a bit of, so the history of that, of the Conservative Party is of supporting Israel, but there's sort of increasing, I guess, pro-Palestine sentiment. And I think that comes from the Conservatives kind of wanting to detoxify their image. So famously, David Cameron, who's just been nominated to the Foreign Secretary, wanted to detoxify the party's image because it was perceived to be the nasty party. They hold a kind of altruistic moral standard, and yet they support things like capitalism and which is selfish, and so on and so forth. So when he first came into office in 2010, he actually went to Turkey and made a speech saying that the situation in Gaza couldn't continue. It's an open-air prison, and echoing a lot of the kind of left-wing talking points about Israel and Palestine. And that's made a lot of people kind of concerned that he's coming in and as the foreign secretary now. And I think you don't have to be too concerned. I think he's basically walking the wobbly line that most Western leaders have walked, which is saying, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself and so on and so forth. But Israel needs to tie its hand behind its back, and Palestine has a right to exist, and so on and so forth. So there is a division, and the division is increasing. But I get the sense that the division in the United States, the Republican Party, is kind of more deeply felt.
Maybe that's so. I'm not sure. I think the left infects everything, including the right. And you can see with Tucker Carlson and some of the more extreme right-wing nationalists that eventually they sort of come together in a sort of anti-corporatist perspective. But I think conservatives generally, since they align with the Judeo-Christian ethic and a biblical orientation to the world, more or less support Israel as sort of as Christians, as devout Christians. I think they feel supportive of Israel. But there's a nationalist contingent that is very much against aid to foreign countries. Of course, I think as objectivists, we can agree with that concept that aid to foreign countries isn't necessarily the way to go, but it encompasses even moments like this, where an ally that's relatively democratic is under attack by an authoritarian theocratic regime, and yet still they want to apply the principle that, hey, we have people here at home hungry, veterans going without food. It's them we need to sacrifice our lives to and our resources to, not the people of Israel, even if they're on the front lines of terrorism, and even if what's happening there will be exported to our country. So, I mean, to me, I see the libertarian, anti-state, anti-foreign aid contingent as the one that's primarily against what's going on in Israel today. But I don't see it as widespread. Do you perceive something different in the conservative movement than I am?
Well, just looking at American politics from a distance over the last few years, the separation on Israel and Palestine at least seems to me to broadly resemble the split that there seems to be around support for Ukraine, or at least there seems to be similarities. So the way it looks from over here, the Conservatives reacted in one of two ways towards Ukraine. Either they've been very supportive of Ukraine, they recognize that Putin's a problem, and that Ukraine is the attacked party and we need to support Ukraine. Or you get, I guess, maybe a more isolationist wing, maybe that's not fair to call them, but basically who don't see why we should be giving all this money and weapons to Ukraine to defend itself. Ukraine's a bit of a corrupt nation anyway. And maybe they're kind of Christian and Putin's a Christian, so maybe he's not all that bad of a guy. And that seems to be the kind of split in the American Conservative Party's conservative movement's reaction to Ukraine. And broadly, I think it seems to be, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, the same kind of people who fall on those side of the lines as fall on the same side of the lines with Israel and Palestine. So, we were talking just before we went on about Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens. And broadly, I think I'm right in saying that Ben Shapiro has been supportive of the United States being in favor of Ukraine. And then I think Candace Owens, who's been critical of Israel, would also be critical of the United States policy in supporting Ukraine. And so I think I think it's coming from the same kind of place. At least that's the way it seems from over here.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the Christians in some respect have to be torn, and Candace Owens is a pretty pronounced Christian, right? She's in the tweet thread between she and Ben Shapiro, she was quoting from New Testament scripture and sort of throwing that in his face. And I think Christians have to be split morally, right? In the sense that the Judeo-Christian ethic has to urge them towards participating in Israel's side. There's also the sacrificial ethics and the material hating ethics and the essential anti-Western ideas behind Christian anti-materialism that have to pull them towards the underdog in some way, or at least pull them away from Israel. So I see them as sort of torn. But I mean, this feud between Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro seems to have taken on a personal flavor. It's not so much about her view on Israel and what we should do as much as it's become about something long-standing and simmering that seems to have been going on between the two of them that's finally bubbled to the surface. So yeah, I mean, there on the right, I do see it's strange because I see this on the left too, and it just shows you how these poles merge together at a certain place. I see a great deal of sympathy for Islamicism on the left, right? With the now the resurgence of Osama bin Laden's letter in the youth, some women even converting to Islam. I think I heard that on Yaron Brook's show, so their solution, many of these progressive women, since the alternative to their nihilism is embracing some form of religion, they're actually embracing Islam, and they're doing that a great deal on the left. But there are some arch conservatives, even people like Zuby, who respect the order and traditionality of Islam and are putting that forward as an alternative too. So they're, I think the people who came out for Putin are also those religious traditionalists and respect his traditionalism, his nationalism, his Christianity, and put that above, or make that the focus of their politics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think that seems to be the case with Candace Owens. I haven't followed her career too closely, but she kind of became famous, was it, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, around the kind of Brexit movement of supporting that Black people shouldn't necessarily vote democratically kind of automatically anymore, and opposing a kind of groupthink around that kind of thing. And then she's been employed at the Daily Wire for the last, I think, 2 years. And there's a way in which I think this dispute kind of makes sense, because it's always seemed quite weird to me that Ben Shapiro should be allying himself with these very strong Christian types. And there's a sense in which it makes sense, in that they're advocates of faith. Some of the conservative policies that they would probably like to see take root in American society are probably going to be very similar. But Judaism and Christianity are at the root are very incompatible religions. We talk about Judeo-Christian values, but if Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, Ben Shapiro, if all of their kind of enemies on the left are taken off the playing field, presumably then they would be actually the political wings which would be combating each other. So it's a kind of coalition of convenience, I think. And I would have to assume that this conflict that we're seeing between Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens is, in a sense, a bubbling up of that fundamental difference. And there's something strange about it, that it's happening in public, because he's, in a sense, her employer, and he's been going on speaking tours around the world, speaking actually fairly well on the pro-Israel side. And yet in some of his comments somewhere, it was recorded, he said he was denigrating her opinion and I think to some extent her intellectual ability. And then this argument is spilled out on Twitter, in which he told her on Twitter to quit. I would have to assume that there are contractual reasons why he can't just fire her, but it's a bit embarrassing really to have the employer and the employee having a fight on Twitter about whether she should be working at the Daily Wire. So I would have to assume that this difference is coming from their kind of incompatible religions.
Well, yeah, this is certainly an alliance of convenience, I'm sure. Reagan allied himself with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight a common enemy. In his mind, it wasn't just Soviet Russia, but atheistic Soviet Russia, and he thought he was allying himself with mystic brothers that would help get us over that diplomatic hump, so to speak. And we as objectivists are constantly told that we should be compromising with conservatives because we need to overcome the enemy in the moment. But that kind of compromise, of course, is the road to perdition. It's the opening of the road to perdition. You will, once you've compromised your values, you can't uncompromise them, especially when you do so publicly. You can't ally yourself with the enemy of your enemy, or somebody who seems to be allied with you in a peculiar issue so you can get over another one. You have to be philosophically and morally sound. You have to have complete and total integrity. And that's something that certainly the conservatives are not doing. The religious folks are uniting because that's what they share in common, even though they might not share much else.
Yeah. And so I guess the one bit that I've not seen, I guess, or the one puzzle piece I've not seen in this puzzle is how is the Republican Party itself reacting to this? Because I've seen the kind of split that there seems to be about support for Ukraine in the Republican Party, but what is the situation like with support for Israel? Because traditionally I would typically associate the Republican Party with being very pro-Israel, for the last however many decades. But so then my prediction would be that we would see increasing skepticism about sending aid to Israel, sending money, supporting Netanyahu. Is that right? Are Republican candidates sort of increasingly skeptical about supporting Israel or even pro-Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I haven't had my finger on the pulse of things, but my suspicion is the same as yours, that the Republicans have historically been the supporters of Israel, and I haven't seen anything to make me feel like the Republican establishment is turning its back on Israel at all. I do see popular pundits like Tucker Carlson moving left in a lot of ways, and that could eventually come down to embracing an idea that is anti-Israel.
For sure.
Do you see something different? And maybe I'm just not paying attention to the headlines.
No, I think that's right. And Tucker Carlson's an interesting case because he's really changed over the last, over the course of his career. I've seen things from when he was sort of starting out his career, more so as a writer, and he was kind of a darling of the American right. And I guess in a way he still is, but he's really changed his orientation on a lot of things. He seems to be much more pro liberty in the past, and yet it's become increasingly collectivistic over the last probably the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years. And he did an interview with Candace Owens, if people haven't seen it, in which she kind of lays out her position. And it's interesting kind of how sneery and critical some of the kind of tone is towards Ben Shapiro in that interview. And I mean, I agree with you that shouldn't make an alliance with conservatives, but Ben Shapiro is actually, I think, pretty good on this issue. I've watched some of the speeches he's gone and done, and they're broadly commendable. He doesn't quite have the perspective on it that an objectivist would, which is kind of that Israel is the kind of source of civilization in the region and is fundamentally rights respecting. So that's, gives them legitimacy as a state. He supports it more from a kind of perspective of the Jews need a homeland to protect them from persecution, which is a kind of more typical, I think, traditional perspective on it. But he's still pretty good. And it is, so although, I've said that I think it makes sense in a way that Candace Owens would conflict with him, it also is peculiar to me. And I don't know, what do you make of Candace Owens as a person? because well, I just want to hear first before I say what I think.
Well, I mean, early on, before she became a celebrity, I liked that she pushed back against the groupthink that seems to be infecting, the Democratic members, the Black Caucus, people who are active politically. They seem to have forgotten the history of the Democratic Party, and 90% of the Black vote goes to the Democratic Party, who, in my opinion, are totally racist and have always been racist and are still racist. They've Marxized the language so that it sounds like they're actually being charitable when they're really not. And so for her to bring, in more primitive terms than a Shelby Steele or some of the other prominent Black thinkers, the Thomas Sowells, the Walter Williams, to her to popularize some of these ideas, I thought I really liked her at first. I like that she went against and pushed back against BLM, and I like that she tried to start a movement of an exodus from the Democratic Party. But once she became popular, once these folks become popular on the right, there's a palpable metamorphosis that seems to happen, and they embrace other aspects of the Republican ideology that I think are very toxic. So so now I'm seeing the toxic Candace Owen, and I've seen that for a little bit now. Once she's fully embraced Christianity as this sort of moral base of her political ideology, things start to go south. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I very much agree. When she first came to prominence, I think it would have been in 2018 around the kind of Brexit thing. I was really impressed because I think it took a lot of guts to say that kind of thing. It's not at all well received by people, and I think by my impression, by kind of the Black people that she would have been speaking to, because I remember seeing this video of her speaking on stage saying that Black people are defaulting just to voting for the Democrats, and making the kind of groupthink point. And it wasn't at all well received by the audience, who were kind of offended, I guess, by that suggestion. But I think that was an important point to make. So yeah, I had a very good impression of her to start off with, and the people who she works with, in effect, at the Daily Wire, so herself, Michael Knowles, and Matt Walsh, are all very religious and very Christian in a fundamental way. And seeing that side of her be brought out has really exposed the side of her, which I think is really unimpressive. As I said, I don't follow her too closely, but my partner listens to her podcast occasionally, and I'll be in the kitchen or something, and she'll come in and have to just tell me what has just gone on Candace Owens' podcast, and it sounds very unimpressive, very unintellectual, lots of pushing of religion, and lots of sort of very bad faith characterizations of her opponents. So yeah, so this is just kind of the final nail in a long line of being unimpressed with Candace Owens. And
why do you think that? I mean, what do you think happens to these folks? I don't know if I've noticed that a little bit more with Dave Rubin as well. I feel like once these guys get set in, they become part of the right-wing establishment, the stuff that made them interesting goes away, because in order to gain more popularity with the Republican establishment, you got to accept religion, and you got to accept nationalism, because that's quickly becoming the default stance of the Republican Party. And they all do.
Yeah.
I mean, we had an opportunity to convert Dave Rubin early on. I was the first objectivist to go on his show. He started flirting with objectivism, and then he ran headlong into Jordan Peterson. And Peterson is now sort of I think the ideological head of this conservative movement. He'll be the brains behind which nationalism and religion sort of advance even further in the country. And I feel like we could have taken him down and didn't. We had him at an Ocon, and we didn't take him down.
Yeah, I suppose it's a validation of the idea that Rand suggests, that, if someone's pretty good on a idea which is kind of lower down, or higher up, should I say, the philosophical tree, if they're good on politics or something like that, but then they're coming from a kind of fundamentally religious or bad basis, if they've got bad metaphysics, a bad epistemology, whatever. So if they're accepting faith, or if they believe there's an afterlife and something like that, they might be good for a while, but the bad ideas will corrupt eventually, and it'll change the thing that we think is good about them. So for Dave Rubin, he was, very good on individualism, and now he became religious, although when he'd been an atheist for quite a while. And the same thing we saw very recently with Ayn Rand, which is very disappointing. Interestingly, this is a bit of a digression on Dave Rubin, but Ayn Rand didn't say that she'd been convinced that God exists. I get the impression it's the same thing with Dave Rubin. I'm not convinced that he now thinks God exists. It's something like he's convinced of the importance of religion. Do you think that's how it is?
With Ayn?
That's how I think it is with her, but like with Dave Rubin, do you think it?
Probably. Yeah, probably. They're in search of a moral compass, and they've been told by everyone except objectivists that the only moral compass that's possible to you is religion. It's either that or nihilism. And so they turn to that as the solution to what they're seeing on the left, which is total nihilism. Now, we had Dave captured for about a year or a few months. So, and he interviewed Greg Salieri, Ankar Gate, Yaron Brook. So I'm surprised with all of us attacking his front, he didn't see rational egoism as the third possibility, out there. But he didn't. I mean, religion is a seductive thing. It's about emotional experiences, and it's really hard to combat the immediate concrete presence of emotional of feelings with rational arguments. It's just really hard.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I guess another way to think about it, if you think about all the sort of great thinkers there were in the Enlightenment who were making relatively pro-secular arguments which were combating religion, and if you think, and they were titanic intellectual heavyweights compared to, no offense, Dave Rubin, and if you think about how they were fundamentally because they weren't able to change their morality, how their work was undermined. And so if their work is going to be undermined because of their incompatibility of their moral views, then obviously Dave Rubin is going to be undermined as well, you'd have to think.
Well, yeah, I mean, and look at Dennis Prager. I mean, I used to listen to him as a fairly rational voice on many issues, but over the years, his Judaism has just infected everything, to the point that now, even in Prager University, he has videos against the Enlightenment and individualism. So clearly it does eventually infect everything. It has to, because everything's integrated. Now, Daniel said, isn't it also like that with Jordan Peterson? I don't think he believes in God. That may be true. Jordan, I think, looks to the old narratives as as stories that are filled with wisdom, and they could teach us a great deal. And everything you need to know about morality is in all of these ancient stories. And some of those stories happen to be in the Bible, but probably Gilgamesh, Beowulf. You could look at any of these old narratives to give you a sense of moral clarity. So maybe that's his deal, but it feeds into the traditionalist religious ethic of the right.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, because he's always slippery whenever he's asked, does God exist? And maybe he'd be less slippery about it now since he's leaned more into his religious kind of phase. But I think we have to understand that Jordan Peterson is in some sense a pragmatist. And so the literal truth claim of does God exist isn't what's important. It's, as he said, he lives in the fear that God does exist. And that's what's more important to him than literally the existential reality of God, and the impact of the idea of God onto how you live. That's what seems to be more important. And that seems to me to be a very pragmatic position. And it's such a
Hobbesian point of view, if you think about it. I mean, Hobbes thought human beings were savage and they needed to be awed into submission, and that form of awe and submission was the only way civilization could take place. And it seems like he's got that same idea that we're just a bunch of ids running around in a state of savagery. Were it not for the possibility that some justice exists on the other side of the veil, we'd be killing each other and murdering each other. That's so scary, dude. That's so dark. What a dark worldview.
Yeah, Joe, I have a funny story about Hobbes. relating to a friend of mine who I met at university, and he was very pro free markets, pro free speech, broadly kind of individualistic. He went out and protested in favor of free speech during the Count Dankula case in the UK, which, if people aren't familiar with it, it was when this kind of shit posting YouTuber posted a video where he'd decided he was going to wind up his girlfriend by teaching her dog to do a Hitler salute when he says Sieg Heil. And he was then sued about this under the law for, I think, either hateful speech towards Jews or something like that. And whether you think that's a good thing to do or not, to teach your dog to raise its paw like that, he was essentially being sued for posting a video which someone found offensive. So that's a violation of free speech. And this friend of mine went out and protested in favor of that. And then a couple of years go by, he gets interested in philosophy, and he immediately gets interested in all the wrong ideas. And I'm sort of trying to convince him out of this, but I fail. And one of the people he really falls in love with is Thomas Hobbes, and he loves Leviathan. And Leviathan, like Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, is a totalitarian absolute king. It's an absolute state where it can do whatever it needs to do to secure the kind of security of the kingdom. So that it's not free speech, it's not free trade, it's none of that. So he's completely changed his orientation. And one of the last times I saw him, he was describing how joyful he was that he had joined this club, which has its own private library, and they had an original first edition of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and he described the sort of glee he experienced when he held it in his hands to me. And that was kind of the last time I saw him, because we ended up having a falling out about this. So yeah, Thomas Hobbes. Oh, and so this guy as well he studied astrophysics at university, and so was an atheist. And now with this philosophical change, he attends church. He doesn't believe God exists, but again, he kind of thinks religion is important to keep the masses in line, in effect. He thinks that religious morality is important to give meaning to most people's lives and to stop them disrupting the social order, which is very kind of Jordan Peterson-like. It's very much, and even better figures who I kind of like Douglas Murray. As I understand it, Douglas Murray is an atheist, but he also thinks that religious morality, Christian religious morality, is important for giving structure and meaning to the kind of everyday lives of the common people who aren't smart enough to study philosophy and find its constellations for themselves. So
yeah, but philosophy is so contaminated. It's really hard to poke through the crap to get to the one or two jewels that exist there, don't you think? I mean, the philosophers were supposed to give us solutions and answers and help us see life more clearly, and instead they obfuscated everything. They made everything unclear on purpose.
Yeah, no, exactly. And there's a way in which if I said what I just said to these conservative thinkers, they would probably say there are no constellations from philosophy. Look at the postmodernists, look at even just the thinkers who came before them. Philosophy is something which leaves you bereft of certainty and morality and so on and so forth, like David Hume said. So there's a way in which philosophy shoots itself in the foot, and unfortunately, I think that is what feeds into some people re-embracing religion, like Ayn Rand or like David Hume, like Dave Rubin.
And despite them being atheist, I get it. Jonathan Hoenig for $1.99, Benny Bertrand for 99 cents. Thank you guys. Jeff Bannister, $3 Canadian. Regina, €2. Thank you very much. Jeff Bannister is a member for 18 months. People's Party of Canada followers bought into the Nazi Ukrainian money laundering narrative. Immigrants, not ideology, is their enemy. Comments? Do you know anything about that?
I don't. What scandal is that? The
People's Party of Canada followers bought into the Nazi Ukrainian money laundering narrative. Immigrants, not ideology, is their enemy. So I don't know anything about that. I do know that there's certainly a narrative amongst the left that the Ukrainians should not be backed by American money because they're actually Nazis.
Okay.
And there's companies of Nazi soldiers that are fighting the communists, or the traditionalist Russians, whatever they want to call themselves now, and that's what our money is going to support, and it shouldn't. But I don't know what the immigrants, not ideology, is their enemy. I mean, we certainly have that here with respect to the right. Immigrants are certainly the enemy, but that seems to be the case in any statist regime, right? Immigrants are not They don't build you up. They take resources from you and they need to be kept out. Daniel says he can provide some context. So Daniel, do you want to provide some context?
I'll try. I'm not sure what is the specifically Nazi Ukrainian money laundering narrative, because there is the Nazi narrative, the fact that like some people in Azov battalion are supposedly Nazis, which makes the whole Ukrainian army Nazi and as an extent the whole Ukraine a Nazi regime. And there is the laundering narrative where it's with bankmen, if you remember it. It
Oh,
yeah, basically that like Biden provides money to Ukraine, then Ukraine uh, did some like business with bankmen, and bankman supports the Democratic Party, basically Biden, and like this like laundering narrative.
how has that narrative been twisted? Because Bankman also supported the Republican Party. He only gave a few million more to the Democrats.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds a little convoluted to me.
Yeah, yeah. That's a crazy conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I'll just say maybe about Nazis in Ukraine overall. I'm mostly not there, so it's hard to gauge. But my impression is that those battalions are quite isolated. I know quite a lot of people from Eastern Europe, and it definitely is true that there are certain Eastern European countries where more unsavory right-wing views predominate, and more so Hungary than Ukraine, though I have to say. I have a friend from Hungary who I used to work with, and he was very traditionalist, conservative, and I wouldn't really want to know what opinions he would support if he were pushed. But Ukrainians, I don't view as being bad like that. I went to school with some Ukrainians, and I've known some Ukrainians since I've been an adult, and this is just anecdotal, to take it for what it's worth. But I don't view them as being sympathetic to Nazism anywhere to the degree that certain people seem to suggest, that because the suggestion seems to be we shouldn't support them militarily because there's a lot of Nazism there, so they're just as bad a country as Russia is, or even worse. There was a girl who I knew just a few months ago who was a refugee from Ukraine who's got shelter here in Edinburgh and is working, and she was kind of describing the situation in Ukraine, and I didn't have the impression at all that her or the people, they were all living on this boat supplied by the British government, that the people on that boat or the people who've stayed in Ukraine are significantly in any way fascistic. Even if they're more traditionally conservative in some way, I don't think that there's a sympathy for Nazism there at all. So that kind of, and then the money laundering thing sounds really far-fetched to me to kind of make.
Yeah, it's funny that fascism is sort of sweeping every nation, though. I feel like left and right are fascist. They love the corporate state.
Sure.
Corporate statism, that's sort of their vibe now. That's their happy middle ground between absolute socialism and free markets, and they think they're able to do that balancing act between bad and good rather well in their minds. I think even though Nazism itself is as a concept has been thoroughly denigrated in the eyes of the world, fascism has not. They just call it the regulatory state now. Ashley Shrugged, $1.99, listening while scrubbing floors like Cinderella. Thank you, Ashley Shrugged. Well, Morgan, I mean, there we have it. People like us are caught between two poles, the nihilists and the religionists. And I want people out there to know that there is a third way. Rational egoism is the way. And however you come to that, you can start with the novels of Ayn Rand. You can start with objectivist thinking, start with objectivist ethics. Tara Smith's book on normative ethics that expands on Rand's thinking. All of that stuff can help you understand what rational egoism really is, and that, yes, it is possible to know right and wrong with your mind. You don't need it through revelation, and we don't live in a lawless universe. So those don't have to be your alternatives anymore. Morgan, any final comments before we bid the audience adieu?
Just that I guess the common theme amongst what we've been speaking about for the whole episode has been religion. That the source of the source of the split amongst the American right about Israel is a split about religion. The motivator of increasingly right-wing or even fascistic thought in the world is related to faith, was related to religion. So if people are sometimes confused why Ayn Rand thought it was such a terrible thing for Ronald Reagan to kind of bring religion into the Republican Party, we can see, I have seen for a long time, it bearing fruits in the world all over the place. So Be very wary of the people who think that there's something to be gained by embracing religion, even if you don't believe in God, that there's some kind of structure or law and order that can be brought around by holding Christian moral views.
Not to be cynical, but I wonder sometimes if these big pundits' conversions to Christianity have anything to do with political aspirations in the Republican Party. I mean, you can't get elected as a Republican as a straight out atheist. You have to pretend like you accept all these. At the very least, you have to pretend like you accept all these Christian values if you want to make it in that world. Otherwise, it's totally closed to you. What do you think? You think I'm being too cynical?
No, I get that's my impression of American politics, very much so. Even Democratic candidates, like Barack Obama, seem to have to profess Christian faith. Even in the UK, which is much more, politicians talk about religion far less, is my impression, in the UK than they do in the US. It's much more unusual. Like I heard Theresa May once, who was prime minister, in 2017, 2018, refer to God and so on and so forth. And it's really quite shocking when they do it, because it's just isn't usual. American politicians often say, God bless America, something like that. And it would be completely alien for a British politician to say God bless the United Kingdom. But
maybe not God save the Queen, though.
Oh, that's true. They do like singing that, or God save the King now. Okay. But however, my point being that even though it's unusual, if you dig into it, they all end up professing a religious faith typically, because there is, I think, either in some cases it's genuine, or very often there's a perception that it'll poll badly in some way. And I think that's nonsense in the UK, but it's very common for politicians to suddenly grow, a faith organ or something like that when they run for office. So I don't think you're being cynical at all. I think you're probably quite perceptive about how politicians act.
Well, folks, tomorrow we're going to have another Daily Objective. It's going to be on the Democrat split on Israel versus Palestine. Now, that is going to be super interesting. I wonder if I'm going to be in on that show, because there is a violent split on the left with respect to Palestine and Israel, and we know where the loudest voices go. Well, Morgan, thank you for sharing your Sunday with me. It's been a joy, as usual. Guys, visit us tomorrow on the Daily Objective. If you like this content, like and subscribe, and pass this along, because these ideas need to be out there in the world. And always remember to check your premises. Peace.
See you later.